much. I think we're going to do this similarly to the last session. So if I can ask our three speakers to come on up. This is a session that we plan to reflect on the day, reflect on the past 10 years, reflect on what could be happening in the next decade or so. So we've asked three people, key people, to join us. We've got Jessica Wyndham, who started us off, our host from AAAS. We have Rich Cavanagh, who's the Director of Special Programs at NIST. And we have Peter Neufeld, who's one of the co-founders of the Innocence Project. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that he is one of the reasons that we are thinking about paying all this attention to forensic science and ways to improve forensic science. So we're going to begin with just their initial impressions, reflections on the day. I can offer a few questions, general questions that they can answer or not answer, and we'll try to get a discussion. And then again, if people can bring their own questions, offer their own questions or comments to continue this discussion, that would be great. And then, as Deborah mentioned, after this, we do have a reception, and we hope that there'll be a continuation of the exchange of ideas. Beginning just to give your own reflections on things that you thought of during the day, impressions you have of the progress we've made or the gaps that remain. Can you envision a report being conducted, the NIST conducting a report now in 2019? Would it raise the same questions, make the same recommendations? Would we have a different path forward now than we had 10 years ago? And what are you envisioning for questions or topics that we would be thinking about 10 years from now? So Jessica, do you want to start us off?
Sure, thank you. Well, a few reflections. Something that I didn't hear mentioned a lot in the presentations, though it was addressed by Peter Stout in his comments this afternoon, was the why. Why are we here? Why is this an important topic for us even to be speaking about and focusing on? And I think it's always imperative to remind ourselves of that as we prioritize the work, we think about funding and so forth. And so Peter had mentioned the case of George Rodriguez in Houston, who was imprisoned wrongfully for 17 years. There's the report from the Innocence Project that says that the misapplication of forensic science is the second most common contributing factor to wrongful convictions. And then you can go back to the original NIST report that gave its whys. They talked about assisting law enforcement officials to identify perpetrators with higher reliability, reducing the occurrence of wrongful convictions, reducing the risk that true offenders continue to commit crimes, and also enhancing national security. So I think it's always important to come back to the why. Then a few themes that particularly resonated with me. There was the theme about research and the need to always be bringing both basic and applied science together in all the work that we do in this field. Funding, the inadequacy of funding, we hear that an awful lot in the science community generally, but also the fact that there needs to be greater funding for validation studies, for funding reproducibility. And then to join my other Antipodean colleagues, for those who don't understand the term, New Zealand and Australia, it's funny that it's the three of us who picked up on this, but the value of cooperating internationally in this area, that science is global, it is universal, and certainly there are going to be different legal standards that might apply, but there is value in cooperating more internationally in this area. There was obviously a lot of talk about the human element in forensics. We heard that from Albright in his opening keynote, the challenge of discriminability across patterns from Melissa Taylor, John Holloway, and we also heard about it obviously with regard to latent fingerprints and the variability of skills amongst examiners. And so when you think about the human element, and going to your question about where we might see ourselves in 10 years, I pick up on some of the comments we've heard about increased need to focus on electronic and digital evidence more broadly. I think it was in Australia that was one area where you're going to be doing more research, but it hasn't yet, that hasn't been completed. And then moving from digital evidence, particularly into the potential applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So we had a question about that early in the morning, in response to which we heard that NIJ, NSF, and CSAFE are in fact doing research in that area. And so I anticipate that in 10 years we'll be hearing more about that, its applications for training and matching processes. We'll be hearing more, and in an audience like this we'll have more computer scientists than we probably do today. And there'll be more need for training of all of those involved in the judicial system, be they the lawyers, the judges, the juries, so that they understand the nature of this sort of evidence. We understand the way in which the Daubert process does or does not apply, or standard does or does not apply effectively to artificial intelligence. And we'll take on what we heard from Chief Justice McCormack, that we need to be focusing particularly on training in the states, but also in the federal judiciary. So they're just a few reflections.
Well, I can't disagree with any of those. I think I concur. One thing that struck me is the fact that this all takes time, and I saw that and heard that in many of the talks. I'm from a standards organization, and everybody knows it takes a long time to do standards, but I also was struck by how long it took to implement some of the work that's going on, illustrated by the work done on black box studies and the gun shell identification. Those are all almost decade-long efforts. It's also true for how long it takes to get things implemented in the crime labs. I think there are talks from Houston and Virginia both illustrated that was not an overnight success. That's a long, long process. And also, we alluded to some of the success on the National Commission on Forensic Science. That, again, was not an overnight success. It took several years for that group to really learn how to talk to one another. And so it's just struck that we can, taking this time to look back on what's happened in the last 10 years, it hasn't been an overnight success, but I think we've seen that there's been substantial progress if we look in the right places. If we look in the wrong places, we may not see that kind of progress, but we do see evidence there is, that impact is being felt and it's happening. If we were to do this meeting 10 years from now, the first thing I think, the way I would see it, it wouldn't be a one-day event, it would be a 5-day event. Because there'd be a lot more success stories, we wouldn't have to look quite so hard to find them. We'd see them, more of them in pattern evidence, both in shoe prints and in latent prints and tool marks. We'd have a lot more work we'd be hearing about in digital, and I'm sure we'd be hearing lots on the artificial intelligence front. A big question in that whole space is how much can you trust what comes out of artificial intelligence? That's a technical question to answer. It's not just a cocktail, although that would be a good thing to talk about over cocktails. And I think the other thing we would hear, I'm not quite sure what the right way to say this is, we heard a lot about convergence on a common language and how to talk about things. Is it a common language for researchers? That same common language, is that used by practitioners, and is that same common language a useful language for decision makers or possibly for the courts? And I think that discussion is something that is not just a federal discussion. The states have to be part of that discussion. The federal government's not going to tell us what words to use, or they might tell me what words to use, but they're not going to tell 95% of the work what words to use. And I think if there was a new charge to the NAS, what I'd like to see that charge include, beyond what was in the charge 10 years ago, was ask the Academy to provide their thoughts on the difference between discovery science and reliable science. They're two different things. I mean, there's lots of rewards for people doing brand new discoveries, but when in the forensics world and judicial world, when you look at science, you want to know that it's reliable science. Can you count on it giving you the same result each time? Manufacturing world does that in a very nice way. When you go out to buy a car and you order one to be a certain color green, you don't expect it to be pink when it comes to the delivery lot, and the manufacturer knows how to get that same color in every car. They know how to make parts that are interchangeable on every car. That's an issue of reliability, and science knows how to help with that. The second thing I think I would like to see on the next charge, and this is the one where the Academy well, I guess Congress charges the Academy to do these studies, and so Congress has to ask the right question of the Academy. And I think that goes into areas of ethics. A lot of what we saw in elements of what we heard today in the original Academy report talked about ethics for practitioners. And the Academy's done terrific work over the years on talking about ethical issues in the sciences. I think there's a series called On Being a Scientist, and it lays out why scientists have a responsibility to society to do their work in a transparent way and to resolve uncertainties and not to falsify their data, not to fabricate data, not to plagiarize. There's a huge responsibility that scientists learn about when they're in their schooling. But there's a bigger discussion on ethics because that kind of ethical principles that we come to expect scientists to accept and rely on are not necessarily the kinds of principles that map into a career path in the justice system. There's a responsibility there to provide the best presentation for your client. And that's where that's sort of two ethical worlds that have to live together here. And I would think it'd be wonderful if the Academy would tell us how to think that one through.
Thanks. So, I mean, just first as a disclaimer, I missed the early morning sessions. So, but one thing I did learn a long time ago from Tom is the vagaries of memory, and so it's easier for me to think about what's most recent than what is most prime. And so I can go back to the last session, and it's interesting because, at least start there. It's not a coincidence that the NAS was not followed in the courts. As Joe pointed out, there were issues involving Daubert or Daubert. And it's not simply that the motions were not brought. The motions were brought early on. And if you look at it in terms of outcome, when those motions were brought by defense attorneys challenging forensic science profits by prosecutors, the prosecutors invariably won. Whereas in the civil cases, when the forensic scientific evidence was proffered by a plaintiff in a toxic tort or other kinds of action and challenged by a defendant, the defendant invariably won, or most frequently won. And so one could do a root cause analysis, and not just of Daubert. And as Joe pointed out, he referenced Rule 702. Daubert is 1992, so it's before the NAS in 2009. Rule 702 is way before the NAS report, and it explicitly talks about the necessity of the expert evidence being based on reliable methods and reliably applied in the instant case. So reliability and validity was out there in 702 for years, was out there in Daubert for years, but not actually utilized by the courts. And so one could go to somebody like John at the Quattrone Center and ask for a root cause analysis. And I think what you'd find are there are structural reasons in our criminal justice system for that kind of failure of the courts to deliver on any of these major quality impositions, okay? I'm not going to say what they are, but they're out there, and they're not just systemic, they're also cultural. Otherwise, you wouldn't see it consistently not applied over the last 30 years. But it's something to think about. The other thing, though, is because we recognize that kind of continuous serial failure in the courts, what we've tried to do, as was mentioned by Bridget and others this afternoon, is think about upstream. And upstream becomes a lot more efficacious in criminal justice, going back to some of the things that Julia said about criminal defense attorneys and certain inequities in the system. It needs to be upstream. All these things need to be fixed before a case ever comes to court. And I mean, when I say court, it's not being fixed by discovery. It has to be right. The scientists have to get it right when the crime is under investigation. Because if you don't get it right when it's under investigation, then the adjudication will be biased. And it's almost a foregone conclusion. Whether it be by a verdict or by a plea bargain, it's gone. And so what I am pleased to see, as Joe alluded to at the very end of his remarks, is that there has been, and I'm told that John Butler talked about a lot of this morning, there has been an incredible effort by the forensic science community, and to a certain extent, by people who are involved in the basic sciences, whether it's physics, chemistry, biology, or neuroscience, to try and be more involved in this. And it is frustrating when that doesn't happen, when there isn't that kind of cooperation with people who are not in the forensic community to be involved in the basic and applied research. But what's great is the way that NIST has stepped up, the way that entities like CSAFE have stepped up to try and push that kind of basic and applied research forward. And that is a great consequence of the NIST report, and it makes me a lot more hopeful as well. And listening to folks like Linda talk about how in her laboratories in Virginia, they're thinking about human factors. Okay, that is an outgrowth of the report and the kind of work that's come out of the scientific community and the forensic scientific community, and it's something that we can appreciate the fruits of hopefully in years to come. So those are all causes for, some kind of hopefulness about all of this. It's somewhat remarkable in terms of a learning moment that our lunchtime speaker from Australia, and by the way, I have a lot of concerns about a NIST that is under the oversight of 9 law enforcement organizations. I mean, one of the things that the NIST report really said very specifically is that this should not be based at DOJ, it could not be based at the FBI, and actually Joe's remarks saying that when people talked about reforming the federal rules of criminal discovery to make it more like civil discovery, or to give 702 more bite so judges actually really do engage in their gatekeeping function, there was huge pushback from DOJ. And that's because DOJ has that conflict of interest. It's not a bad conflict of interest, but they have it. And that's why they're pushing back on those things. And that's why this whole endeavor has to be housed fundamentally in an agency and amongst people where science is the first priority, not justice, not law enforcement. And when you talk about our criminal justice system and the structural problems, it's not about whether you're an adversarial system or an inquisitorial system. There are international human rights groups that actually evaluate the quality of criminal justice in 126 countries. Go online, don't take my word for it. It's called the World Justice Project, and they're thinking about the rule of law. They've interviewed tens of thousands of people on the ground in every one of these countries. They rely on thousands of surveys in these countries. And the truth is that the criminal justice system here in this country scores worse than just about every single country in Europe. And it's not about whether you're inquisitorial or adversarial. It has to do with those other structural issues. It has to do with the reality of discrimination in our system and racial biases in our system. It has to do with the fact that there is more due process in a lot of those other criminal justice systems than there is in ours. And those are the things that we have to work out in the courts, in criminal justice system, in the role of prosecutors, in the role of defense. And we will. But you can't I'm not going to put my investment there. I'm going to put it in people who really care about fundamental principles of science. All right? That's our best hope. And frankly, what's been great about it is not only are you doing all this kind of good work in research, basic and applied, and thinking about standards, okay, but it's also spread out to other types of investigatory evidence. It's spread out in the work that Tom did with the NAS on understanding eyewitness identification. People are now trying to apply scientific principles to evaluating what's the most efficacious way to get to the truth in an interrogation. So all the work that came out of the NS report is finding new homes and new applications throughout all the different types of evidence that are used to investigate and adjudicate crimes. And that's fabulous. The last thing I was supposed to talk about, the future, 10 years from now. So I'm going off on a certainly different kind of track, because I think that you know, what I see happening in future problems that are already arising, okay, are things, you know, new areas like pushing DNA into genetic genealogy, facial recognition, and other kinds of phenotype identifiers. Are emerging reliance, because God knows, I mean, technology and science is really pushing. And criminal justice is so important worldwide that there's going to be tremendous pressure to allow these new technologies in without the kind of robust auditing that you're talking about in manufacturing or in the private sector, or that we see in clinical medicine, which is why I would take some issue with Mr. Peters' point about, you know, when he talks about risk and introducing some new forensic discipline, that it's sort of like the risk taken by a pharmaceutical company with a new drug. It's not the same, because when the pharmaceutical company wants to take that risk, there's oversight, there's the FDA, there's CLIA, there's you know, the Commission on Medicare and Medicaid Services. They're all in there. We have nothing analogous in forensic science at all. So the risks are what? That a judge is going to keep it out or let it in? Not the same thing. And so when we think about things like you know, facial recognition or genetic genealogy, or our new reliance on algorithms and artificial intelligence, and that's where it's going, all those areas, we better have systems in place to provide the oversight to make sure that when they come in, it's done with an understanding of the limitations of those disciplines. That validity, foundational validity, has been demonstrated. It was great to hear everybody using the term foundational validity earlier today, and reliability. You know, I haven't heard that in a long time up until the NIST report, and that's terrific. But we better make sure that there are oversight mechanisms in place to deal with that, because there are huge privacy issues. And science can't just be concerned with reliability. That's not enough. It has to be concerned with the other social issues. So it has to be concerned with discrimination. What impact is all of this going to have on minority populations? Okay? What impact does it have on privacy? What impact does it have on basic fundamental human rights? And science has that responsibility, and criminal justice has that responsibility. But I assure you, without institutions in place to have that oversight, we're not going to get it. You know, I remember when I first started in this stuff, it was a long time ago, and there was something called the Human Genome Project. And when they were doing, for every dollar of research, they had to spend, I don't know if Anne Marie will correct me on this, it's whether it's 5 cents on the dollar or 7 cents on the dollar, to deal with the ethical, legal, and social implications of all of this. But we're not spending 5 cents on the dollar to explore the ethical, legal, and social implications of all the research that's going on in forensic science, or to investigate and adjudicate crime. We're not doing it. And unless we are willing to put forward that money for that research, okay, to understand the implications, it's going to continue to be a problem. So all of you hopefully will make that a different ending, and I am hopeful. Sorry.
I have one.
So, does anybody else want to chime in after here?
Well, I would certainly add that we see privacy coming up in lots of different spaces. Forensics is one of them, but you see it in the commercial world constantly, and it's also going to be tied back to what artificial intelligence can do. I know there was an example, I think, in a biometric space, I think it was facial recognition, where I think the FBI was involved. I'm pretty sure, and there were some NIST people, and it was demonstrated there that one analyst could do facial recognition at a certain level of performance. If he partnered with a second human to do that analysis, as a team, they did better. But if you partnered with artificial intelligence instead of a second human to do the analysis, the performance was even higher. And so we're seeing the fact that even in the biometric space, artificial intelligence is already starting to show its power to do things that a human alone just can't do. So, and we're gonna see that in lots of other fields, and it's going to be an issue to deal with in forensics.
Yeah, I do think there's probably agreement that 10 years from now, that is going to be a big issue that will be being grappled with, whether it's in an NIST report or in other forums. Are there any comments or questions from the audience?
Yeah, Austin Hicklin-Nobles. I'm one of the computer science people, so at least some here. I can speak some on what has been going on with machine learning, because if you go back to the 90s, when somebody was arrested, that fingerprint card was compared by a human being. Now that when arrests, those comparisons of exemplar fingerprints are fully automated, and it's something where it's not just more accurate than the person, the people have administrative problems. And so machine learning has done a great deal on that. And also, when you search, again with latent fingerprints, when you search the FBI system, it has 100 million people in the database, and so it comes back with the 20 most similar fingerprints out of 1 billion fingers. And so it's really rather remarkable, and that's continued to evolve very dramatically over the 25 years I've been working on this. The thing is, though, that there's a threshold difference that with the exemplars, there's a process in place where it is accepted that those 10 fingerprints, the statistical certainty off of that machine learning is incredibly high. When you have one crappy latent fingerprint, then the responses are much, much murkier. And so I think what we are going to be seeing, and I know this actually in fairly some detail, there's some latent fingerprints that could be automated with the kind of certainty that a human being might have, but it's a small percentage. And gradually over the course of coming years, that the machine learning will eat more into the poorer quality ones, but taking the burden away from the examiner and putting on a system when many of the latent fingerprints that are compared today are still a long way away from being able to be fully automated matching with the kinds of probabilities that would be useful in court. So, and the similar kinds of things we've had decades of work in speech, in handwriting, in various things. But I think fingerprints have been one of the ones that's been a massively notable difference in the 25 years I've been working this. Sorry, just a comment, not a question.
So my name is Ed German. I'm a forensic scientist at the smallest agency in the room from the Macon County Sheriff's Office in Illinois. My wife and I drove 802 miles to get here out of our own pocket. I was the first latent print examiner to give information to the NIST study back in 2007. At that time, I was in charge of fingerprints for the CIA and also for biometric identification. I'm a biometric scientist. That's for the last 48 years. Mainly, I've worked fingerprints at FBI and DOD and the CIA, and also for the last 20 years, FACE. I wanted to address a couple of things. Number 12 on the 13 recommendations from the NIST report was AAAS interoperability, and that wasn't mentioned very much here today. Number 12 actually said develop, a standard for interoperability. The problem is we've gone backwards. And what I mean by that is agencies can do less today with AAAS interoperability than they could 10 years ago. And a good example is I'm in Illinois. And in Illinois, the 5th largest state in the country, we used to be able to search the FBI directly from any agency, like my tiny sheriff's office in Macon County, Illinois, but the FBI shut that off about 5 years ago because under the AAAS interoperability, everybody's supposed to go through what's called their state CJIS WAN, Criminal Justice Information Services, Wide Area Network. The problem is the AAAS vendors around the country saw that as a way to make money. People kept mentioning money here today, and what it means is, as opposed to be able to search free like we used to, going directly to the FBI through what was called LEO, Law Enforcement Online, now you have to buy a $40,000 terminal that most small agencies cannot afford. Fingerprints is the widest the greatest majority of forensic evidence in the United States and around the world. I've lived on 4 continents and worked on 6 continents with forensic laboratories, and fingerprints are everywhere. But in Illinois, for example, right now, and in a lot of states in America, small agencies cannot even search the FBI. They have to wait, send their evidence to the state crime lab. In Illinois, that means of the 8 state laboratories, and I was in charge of Illinois State Police's lab system in the early 1980s when they became the first accredited lab. But it's either 90 days to 1 year before they even open up the envelope to look at your evidence to see if the fingerprints are good enough to search. That's how we've gone backwards. So, something needs to happen about that. Hopefully, a decade from now, we're going to hear good news that APHIS interoperability actually works. So we made a standard, but things were shut down so that most fingerprint experts in the United States, again, 60% of all the fingerprint work does not happen in crime labs. 60% of the fingerprint work in America happens outside of accredited laboratories, outside of crime labs. It's at Podunk, Alabama police departments and sheriff's offices with fingerprint experts, and that's a problem for us. Talked about artificial intelligence. That's very active, both with fingerprints and face. I chaired the Biometrics and Information Services Subcommittee for the IAI and also their facial recognition subcommittees. I can tell you there are at least 50 agencies in the United States that are using artificial intelligence, facial recognition right now today to search against 2.5 billion faces worldwide instantaneously. And as far as protecting society, what they do is it's never given as a scientific individualization. It's just an investigative lead with a caveat on the front and the back that says this is not an identification, this is just an investigative lead. Additional work is needed to justify an arrest or to get an arrest warrant. And basically that's it. Sorry for talking so much. This has actually been a wonderful, a day for me listening to everything that's been going on. What has happened has been momentous progress, but there's still a long way to go for a lot of work.
Thank you. Did you want to address the interoperability?
I don't have anything to say on APHIS. It's an important point, but
I think it's really good to highlight, that issue of the smaller lab, like who's doing what where and what resources do people need and how do we improve all the way down the system. So I think we're ready to wrap up, and please thank our panelists again.